We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of In the Weeds with Jimmy Young. Every week, we look for those movers and shakers in the world of cannabis, in business especially, and seek them out. And we are so happy to welcome one in from the other coast. For the most people know that, we're based outside of Boston on the East Coast. So we're going to head out to the West Coast. And everybody knows I love to continue to connect both coasts. Rob Sechrist, he's the co-founder and president of the Polaris Equity Group and the manager of the Pelorus Fund. Rob, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so let's get right into it a little bit. How in the world did we go from real estate into cannabis real estate? And is that still the focus of your fund?
Yes, it is the pure focus of our fund. And we've always been an asset-based lender. We've originated more than 5,000 transactions for more than $5 billion. Our local congressman was Dana Rohrabacher. And so Dana Rohrabacher is a friend and we support him locally. Yep. And when he passed the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment at the time, we realized this was the largest newly created asset class to lend on in the country. And so we analyzed the sector and we realized we had the skill set to do it. So by 2016, we started originating transactions and we became the first dedicated lender to the sector. And we launched the Polaris Fund in 2018, and we became a private mortgage REIT in 2020. And today we've done 72 transactions for more than $450 million.
Wow, that's impressive numbers. And you rattled those right off. That's very good. It's like a batting average, I think. So Rob, is everything I hear about the markets and investment markets in the cannabis space, is it slowed down? Okay. Over the last 6 months, the stock market took a hit, and we pick a crisis, any crisis. We got wars, we got climates, we've got disease. How much, in your opinion, again, an opinion here, as you look at the space, is there still activity in the cannabis investment space?
So I like to differentiate the cannabis sector. So most people talk about it from the cannabis operator side, investing in the brands, and typically they're talking about the equity markets. We are a lender, and so our investment, when people invest with us, we're lending capital and it's secured by real estate, and then the owners of those properties are our borrowers, then have cannabis use tenants. And those tenants, their values going up and down are not necessarily a reflection of them making the lease payment on that. So our ability to raise capital has remained consistent, but it's a different risk profile. We're secured by real estate. We have monthly distributions. It's not a buy and hold for 10 years or whatever it might be for a speculative brand in this sector. We are making monthly distributions. We're secured by enormous amounts of equity, and it's a different spectrum of investment.
Gotcha. One of the things that you just mentioned, and I will admit, I watched the interview with Josh Kincaid, the Talking Hedge. He's our Washington State correspondent. You did it 2 years ago, and I did hear a lot of talk about having tenant improvements and how that makes it more appealing. Can you walk me through a little bit about what you mean by tenant improvements? And are you involved with a construction company too, that I would guess would be tied to that?
Sure. So we're only the lender. And as this specialty use asset class became available, cannabis, cannabis requires enormous capital improvements to the property, whether it exists already or is going to be ground up. And those can be ground up construction and then tenant improvements for that borrower and equipment. And this specialty use asset class is most similar to cold storage, data centers, or lab space. And so all those types of sectors mean that the amount of improvements that are required to bring in these specialty use tenants, which drive much higher lease rates than a typical tenant, are enormous amounts of capital. And sometimes the improvements in the equipment can be more than the value of the building purchase itself. And so our specialty has been asset-based lending was value add lending, where we're doing construction loans, which it's either ground up construction, tenant improvements, or repositioning of that asset to make it more valuable. And so every single cannabis transaction in the beginning needed that. Now, today, we also have a fully stabilized loan product that we can reduce a borrower's rate so that once they're cash flowing, they can step down from a construction loan.
As we all know, interest rates are going up. Everybody's talking about inflation. Is this impacting the real estate market too at all? What do you think about what's going on with that?
So in broad, it's affecting the real estate market enormously because the cost of borrowing is going up. For us, we raise our capital internally, so we're not tied to the external markets. But our investors, if what yield that we were able to give them 2 years ago is now not the same, and they can get that from government bonds or municipal bonds or something, our rate needs to go up as well. So our loans are tied to floating rates as well. So as the market moves, our rates will go up with what's happening out there as well.
Do you have to work harder now, Rob, basically to get the same results or better results?
Well, we're always working extremely hard. In the beginning, it was only 3 of us, and now it's 15. But there is enormous challenges and working hard all the time in raising capital and originating. But the velocity of loans has not slowed down. The velocity of capital has not slowed down in the sector that we're in. And I think people are finding that we're a safe bet. We have no volatility of our share price because we're not publicly traded and we're secured. So you can come and get put money here and have a safe investment with us. In some scenarios, we have equity kickers in some of these transactions. So you are getting some of that exposure, but you're in a completely different risk category. Gotcha.
And again, I apologize. I'm not really as well versed in this world as I would like to. I have friends. I actually rely on my friends to explain it to me. So I appreciate you allowing me to perhaps bring it down to the level that those that are starting to get into the cannabis industry, perhaps for the first time, this is a whole new world for everybody, isn't it? And how challenging has that been when you have to educate people about exactly what you're doing in this space? It's enormously challenging. We had about 250 investors, probably up to $1 million a piece of commitments to us prior to coming to cannabis. And we only got 10% of them to come this direction. And these are people that we had decades of long relationships and made lots and lots of money for. And it's truly an educational, all we do is educate our borrowers and our investors and really try to explain the nuances of the space. And for somebody that's just trying to get into the sector and start investing in the sector, to take a bet on one company and hope that that one pays off if you went in on equity prior to going public is you don't know anything about cannabis. So how do you even underwrite that? And there's not even enough metrics of data to understand the sector. Now today that's starting to change, but for an investor with us, you have lots and lots. We've underwritten 2,000 transactions. We funded 72, and we've had half of those pay off. And we've taken all the data from all those 2,000 transactions and aggregated to know from the real estate side, what is the true metrics for the borrowers and what's really happening. We've seen more data than anybody in the entire country, probably the world, for understanding what are the metrics for these properties and how they should look. And we've also built our own proprietary database to look at it from the real estate side. We know where every single licensed operator is in the entire country, what kind of license they have, who owns it, and where are they situated in the country. Yeah, it's it's a challenge out there in the cannabis space because the stigma alone, the education that all of us who are in it have to explain to people, and I don't want to dumb it down because there's so much science and research that's driving the green rush towards investment in this country. Can you give me an example? Again, you don't have to, of fighting a stigma or an example of something that the only reason why you were, so you had to change a plan perhaps because it was cannabis related? Well, our banking, our own bank that we had a massive relationship with tens and tens of millions of dollars, probably 40 accounts. And, all of our borrowers are paying to us every month. Didn't even call us, didn't even send us registered mail. We got a regular mail letter that said that your bank account's being closed in 30 days. And, so it affects
us and everybody else, and we had to move to a cannabis-friendly, federally chartered bank. But imagine having all those borrowers paying us, and that particular bank, by the way, had a very large percentage of our borrowers were coming from their bank. So that means that whatever they're worried about, they're deeper than they think.
Yeah, exactly. And again, making an example, I see this happening all the time. People are now targeting, I believe, people in the cannabis space for, the fact they know that, some of the people that got in early are making a lot of money. But I got to tell you, from what I hear from dispensary owners, some of the ancillary companies, the margins are shrinking. It's a very small window, I think, for the margins, especially for those that are plant touching, because of the high taxes, the high compliance. California is a mess, isn't it, Rob?
Yeah. So there's money to be made.
Yeah.
There's about 20 to 25 billion that's going to roll through the country this year in gross revenue. How that gets distributed throughout the year to which operators and which brands might change, more are going to become efficient. And what California is the largest market in the world under one compliance. It's also the largest market with the most easily replaceable tenants for our borrowers. And contrary to what a lot of people know about California or hearing about California, our borrowers and our portfolio, and especially the California portfolio, are all performing and the metrics that we're pulling from them, they're able to sustain themselves. And the reason that that's the case is that everybody talks about the California market in a very broad sense. The California market is imploding. Well, that's primarily the outdoor wholesale market. And what's happened is you've gone from illegal operators that transition, and those were outdoor farms that transitioned to the legal market and tried to make it work. And they started selling wholesale to brands that had no cultivation of their own. Well, those brands had made such a large investment in their brand that they couldn't afford to have the price volatility or even no inventory from these wholesalers. So the brands continue to make their own investment in their own cultivation. And so the market for wholesale is dried up. And so all of our borrowers are owner users where they're selling, or they're vertically integrated where they're selling to themselves. So they've eliminated that and they've picked up the margin there. So the market's shifting. What you hear and what's happening in California is much more nuanced than you believe. Now, there are going to be challenges and struggles in every market, but any emerging market is going to have those cycles. And there's going to be other people that figure it out more efficiently, and it's all going to work itself out. Now, when you have government get involved, it typically takes a lot longer because nobody asks, and then what, when they announce a policy, and especially when you have very little to no enforcement. So it'll shake out. I believe that the California market will do well in the long run, but I think that it's a challenge with the compliance, and people are definitely not making what they thought they would make. And especially when you have a dearth of capital that came in and people were purely going for market share as opposed to going for profitability, and they burned up all their money on trying to get market share. Now they have no money for operational when things got tighter. And so that was the biggest mistake that we've seen across the board. It happened in Canada and it happened here. And so those operators that were trying to buy market share, selling below market cost to try to get their brand up so that they could say that they've got the market, it's not sustainable at that. And so if you don't have a product that people are willing to buy at a price that the company can sustain themselves, that company's not going to stay in business.
There's another market that's emerging on the East Coast, and I was just in the capital of the Empire State in New York. How do you view what's going to happen in New York over the next 5 years as that part of the industry, that area, starts to ramp up its own challenges and its own market? I mean, they're gonna have verticals, they're gonna have growing, they're gonna have a lot of social equity applicants in with licenses. Where do you think that New York market's, what do you think is going to happen there? That's really what I'm asking.
So all of these new markets go through that phase, whether they're unlimited license or limited license, and they all have a strategy that they think is going to work best, and hopefully it's going to be refined and get better and better, but it's to be determined. For us as a lender, we don't try to guess on what's going to happen in the market until the regs are written and there's the comment period is ended and we know what the laws are. So we don't have that luxury of being pure equity where we can do speculative investments. So we can only lend when we know what the rules are going to be, and we can write and underwrite that transaction. So for us, we just look at the entire country as the transactions flow to us. We look, what is the best, most experienced operator, strongest sponsor? What's the best transaction that is the best fit for our fund and the least risk for our fund? And that's how we look at things. We're not trying to put a flag in each state to say, hey, we got market share there. That is not our goal. We are willing to go anywhere in the country that the deal looks good, and that makes sense with our underwriting.
Yeah. Hey, do you ever see a wholesale market, international wholesale market for hemp or cannabis? Future?
So the hemp is a whole different category because that doesn't have any legal constraints, and that I think is an amazing product, and hempcrete and all those things are something that we're very interested in just as partners, but we don't have anything active in that, and we can't be in that space. For the U.S. to export, there are DEA licensed facilities that can export for research. They can cross state lines, and I don't think a whole lot of people know that. But to export at scale, you need to typically be GMP certified, which there's several facilities in this country that are already set and ready to go there. But you also have to think about the countries that you're importing to, the lead time from when you file that paperwork to export, and how long it takes to get on the shelf at the dispensary, that product where it's going, and how stale is that product going to be, and can they develop that product domestically? We've already been over to Europe this season, or this last summer, and we were looking at over there and seeing what's going on. And we actually do think that the European market is going to primarily be based on importation, just because it's so expensive. You can't even get power in that country to heat your homes, let alone be able to run a facility. It's just insane. So I think that other countries that don't have the same constraints on employment, on electricity and ESG and all this stuff, as long as they're GMP certified, they're going to be able to come in. So we're really curious how the European Union and different countries in there are going to be able to compete against imports when they're trying to develop their own domestic market. And that's we haven't been able to answer that question yet. Each market has had some sub variances to it that make it a little bit unique, but it's an interesting play.
I was going to say, I'm guessing you look at a lot of Excel files, right? A lot of the numbers, right? A lot of metrics. You've used the word metrics, by the way, about 40 times in the first 20 minutes. Okay. I get it. Okay. So I don't get metrics, by the way. I understand how important it is to you. And what I want to ask you is, what is a key metric that you look for, that you see on a somewhat regular basis and say, this is the kind of thing we're looking for?
We want to see that the transaction will ultimately be able to sustain itself in a profitable way, and it's an equitable transaction to all parties. If it's not equitable, it's not worth going in. We don't want to be into a transaction where we got all the benefit and left the borrower high and dry. It needs to be an equal balance there. So we want to see the right balance of equity from the borrower, the right balance of cost base from our capital side that we have to put out there. And we need to see that transaction has the possibility to sustain itself and perform on its own, that we're not setting that person up for failure because they don't know all those numbers. They don't know those metrics. They only have their own internal projections, or maybe they've worked on 5 or 10 projects, but they haven't seen 2,000 projects.
So is there more risk involved on the plant touching or the ancillary, perhaps even the growing? Well, plant touching is growing, but you got some retail, plant touching, ancillary products like containers and all the packaging material and all the stuff that the retailers have to buy in order to go in business. So
it depends on how you want to categorize risk. So I think it's more risky to be on the ancillary side to cannabis because there's no barriers of entry. And so anybody can come wipe you out. And, you know, if you have a box packaging company that's ancillary to the cannabis sector, you actually have, I think, disproportionate exposure because most of your tenants, or sorry, your accounts payable are coming from people that don't have sustainable cash flows yet. So that is, in my opinion, significantly more risky, as opposed to being in the cannabis sector. yes, it's difficult to do the compliance, but all these difficulties make it more difficult barriers of entry to get in there. And you need to understand how to position yourself. So I think about, when you think about risk, you need to think about it in a more nuanced look at it. So for us, we believe that having an asset and securing an asset and having protective equity in personal and corporate guarantees from our borrowers de-risk it as much as possible. So that's how we got comfortable being in the space. And I think for the equity investors for these companies that are the cannabis tenants, I think that investors should be looking at this as being a long horizon, and don't look for short-term gains. This market is going to grow to probably 45 billion in the next 5 years or so of gross revenue. And you should be looking at the long term and just looking to know that you're in a market that is going to eventually double its size and maybe even go more than that. And you want to pick the right horses if you can, if you have that information. But if you're not an expert in this sector and you're just buying stocks, it's too new. It's barely an emerging industry. There's no data to even look at to make comparables.
Right. That's right. Oh no. And you mentioned our friends, the federal government. I just want to throw this out there. You think they knew what they were doing when they passed that farm bill in 2018 and opened up this Pandora's box for hemp?
I don't think the government ever knows what they're doing. Because anytime government does something, there's a negative consequence from it. Whatever benefit there might be, there's an offset. And so I think that nobody ever thinks it all the way through, and you can't possibly know all the ramifications when you're writing something, because the laws haven't been written yet, or the comment period, which means where they solidify, because the bill was too broad, and now they have to get it nuanced so that it can be implemented. So that one is more complicated. I actually know less about that one because it's more applicable to hemp, and we don't really do anything with hemp. But I think the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment is one of it's, I believe, the most consequential legislation ever written, and nobody really talks about or focuses on that. That one defunded the Department of Justice from any prosecution of a cannabis-related business. So this gave us the ability to enter the sector and not be worried that our borrowers' tenants could be prosecuted and then not be able to replace another tenant because they could be prosecuted too. So the federal government has already been defunded from any prosecution. So that is a massive one that we have. The two I'd like to see is 280E, removed from cannabis, legal cannabis businesses in states that are already illegal. And the other one I'd like to see is the ability to process cannabis transactions on credit cards, so we don't get the cash buildup at the dispensaries.
And there's a couple of companies out there that have tried that, and some have had worse luck than others. Let's just say, I don't think anybody's got it right yet, but they're out there. They've tried to make it as seamless as possible. For at least, I'm talking strictly in the Massachusetts area. We're 4 years into adult use here. 2013 was the medical program. So, how do you view the Massachusetts market right now?
So again, we don't pick winners and losers from markets. We're looking at how experienced is this operator? Is this their, have they already got an existing operation and they're expanding? Were they in another state and now they're coming here? And how strong of a sponsor? How much cash do they have? How much depth do they have for a learning curve as they are moving through this emerging industry, and as the laws and the regulations sometimes change after the fact?
Yeah, can you give me a variety of different typical terms to loans and how it's changed, or does it change from like 4 years ago to where it is now?
So so we have two loan products. We have our value add construction loan product. We lend up to 60% of the total cost basis. So if that would include the purchase price of the real estate, the construction cost or tenant improvement cost, and the equipment. So all of that would be 100%. We'll go up to 60% of that. So you would need to come into 40% of that on that product. That product is typically an 18-month term, and it's typically in the mid-teens interest only. But that particular transaction is made as a construction loan to process an indefinite amount of draws, and we can fund that draw from once it's approved within 72 hours. That is massive in this industry. You want to get the facility built as quickly as possible. And our other fully stabilized loan product is typically a 5-year term, and that's in the low double digits for that particular loan product.
This may be a simplified question for somebody that this type of discussion is a little above my pay grade, if you will, and I appreciate it. Kind of playing along with me. Can you explain the difference between equity financing and debt financing? Because a lot of people in the industry I know are looking at both of those.
So financing is always going to be debt. So I'm trying to maybe figure out what financing really is doing is reducing the amount of equity that you have to go out and raise. So if you didn't have us to be a lender, you would have had to put 100% of equity up to do the build, the purchase, the build, and the equipment. So in the beginning of the business, or when you're starting that operation, that would be the worst possible time to raise the capital. So because you can't get the best valuation. It would be better if you had the facility completed and cash flowing. So we're reducing that by 60%. Now, I think what you might be referring to, I'm just guessing, is there's two types of lending out there. There is asset-based lending for typically for real estate, and then there's corporate lending where you're lending to the corporation, like a Curaleaf at 8%. That is a totally different type of loan, and you're lending off of their equity value. And so that they're basically pledging their stock and all their assets for the collateral of that loan, whereas opposed to that collateral could go up and down at the value of that package. Ours is based just on the real estate, and yes, it could go up and down, but the amount of movement of a real estate asset is so infinitesimal relative to a stock.
Gotcha. Hey, you mentioned the Safe Banking Act. We all know that it's passed 7 times in the U.S. House of Representatives, and supposedly it's being talked about anyway in the U.S. Senate. There's all sorts of scuttlebutt that comes out of the various newsletters that we all follow in the industry, and now they're talking about a Safe Banking Act Plus act because they know they'll never get the CAO bill passed. Certainly not legalization. You mentioned the safe banking, you mentioned 280E. Besides that, is there any other elements of that plus package you'd like to see happen in the next, they're still talking about this year, but I'm not the most confident with what's going on in Washington, D.C. these days.
So broadly, my position is, and it's been this way since prior to this administration coming in, and I said prior to the administration coming in, if they're pro-cannabis, you'll see on day one that they'll reinstate the Cole memo, which they didn't do. So I think that was the first tell. So they're not driving the industry from the executive office. Regarding Congress, it doesn't matter what the House does; they're always going to pass. That's easy peasy. It's the Senate that you need the 60 votes to get through the filibuster. Or you're going to have to get it through reconciliation with a budget, and I just don't see that happening. And so my general take on it is that when people talk about cannabis legalization or regulations, they broadly group two things together, which are separate. There's social justice reform, which is more based towards individuals and trying to right the wrongs and decriminalize it. And then there's the other side that's more towards the business and the regulatory part of it. So more on the business side. And so the two things I mentioned, 280E and the credit cards, those two things could be a standalone amendment and would pass through in 2 seconds through the Senate. But the Democrats are not willing to let those go through without putting on significant social equity reform on it. And that's where I think that both parties are never going to come together to have enough consensus to get anything passed because of the disparity between those two issues. And so that is where I think that I don't see it happening within this administration at all. And I think that generally, if it was going to happen, it's typically going to be in a new administration where you have the executive branch and control of the House and the Senate all contemporaneously. But even then, cannabis in reality is a small thing going on, and I just don't see a new administration blowing out their political capital on something that's only maybe $100 billion at the time, when they probably want to do, free housing for everybody in the country, or free education for everybody, or whatever it might be, which are great things to do, but they're going to want to push something that's massive and not cannabis. Both parties are pro-cannabis, so nobody's voting one way or the other on cannabis. It's called a non-voter issue.
Yeah, it's It's not a good time, I don't think, if you really want to see change happen on anything except a crisis in
But
Washington, D.C.
if I could just add to it,
Go
I
ahead.
do see one path through that could happen fairly quickly. And this would be the way that I believe that it probably might happen. I don't have any insight, but if you want something to get pushed through, you need somebody to drive that and put pressure on the legislators. And so you need a company or a group that is so powerful that they say to each of the senators, they say, you either support this bill and doing this, or we're going to run somebody against you. And so if it's somebody with enough gunpowder, like an Amazon or a huge company that has the gunpowder, and the benefit would be so big for them for it to happen, in that scenario, it could change very quickly, because they don't even need to actually run somebody against them. They just need to tell them that they're going to do it. And so you get in alignment pretty quickly. That's the more quicker path that it could happen. But there's no indicators that that's happening, other than Amazon did say that they're not testing. They're not going to fire their workers if they test positive, as long as they're not high while they're at work.
Would that be a company that maybe has what they refer to as big pharma? Because that's a huge fear in this industry.
Yeah, big pharma, big tech, any of these groups could move that needle. And I think that that's more where you're going to get consensus, because in reality, politicians only care about power for the next election, because they figure if they lose power, then they can't implement change. So you've got to win the war to be able to to put out the policy. So they're only focused on the most nearest term, and not necessarily the benefit of the constituents.
Which really drives me nuts, because it's the constituents who put them there. Okay. And that, isn't that supposed to be how we're not a true democracy. I know that, but we'd like to get back to at least better representation of for our people down there. And our US Senate, and I'll say this, everybody knows I'm from Massachusetts, it doesn't look like our country. It doesn't look, the people that are in the Senate do not look like members of the United States of America right now in 2022. And that really bothers me. It really does.
We are in a representative democracy. And I think most people don't understand what the word representative is before democracy. But, the representatives do not seem to reflect the values of the majority of the people that voted. And that's where the disconnect is. Now, remember, there's a lot of different things that district or that state might have put in power there, and so you're not always going to get perfect alignment of the representation there. But it does seem that we've gotten so far from representing at least the majority in each of these states. Yeah,
and it's a shame. Look, there's one question. Henry Robertson from Matteo did a great job. I want to give him a shout out. Matteo Communications, I think, is really the most active PR company that I see on the East Coast. Certainly. Let's not talk about the West Coast, the East Coast for sure. Here's a great question. Why it's not a good time for cannabis related businesses to sell off a lot of equity to fund their project? Why?
Well, you're at one of the lowest valuations right now. So, it not only is the cannabis markets down, but then you have the additional issue of the volatility of the stock market, the unknown what's happening in inflation. So this is definitely not a place. If I think that most cannabis, well, I shouldn't say most, a lot of cannabis companies are going to do well in the long run. And so if you're able to be a long time holder, and if you truly believe in that company and you've done your due diligence and you've become as much of an expert as you can, or you're following experts in the sector, and you believe that you found that right company, then I would be dollar cost averaging. You're able to pick up additional shares at such a discounted rate that, look at this as a 5 to 10 year hold. If you can weather that, you're going to have a growth stock over time. Is there a better place to put money? I don't know. I don't know what stocks that you're in, but I think that there's always still going to be companies that are going to do well, and there's going to be ones that fail. It's just the normal of all the business. That's how our capitalism works.
Right. Hey, Rob Sechrist, co-founder, president of the Polaris Equity Group. I'm going to make you the cannabis czar. Okay, it's hypothetical here. I think we've had a great conversation. I think it's been terrific. I've learned quite a bit, which I appreciate. what would you like to see? Is there a time frame? Is there a model out there that you think would be fair and also continue slow growth in this entity, because we're still learning quite a bit more about this product than we've ever known, correct?
Yes. So there's a lot packed in there. I believe that the most broadly, to answer your question, I believe that I think that the federal government at this point, the genie is so far out of the bottle, there's no way to put it back in. And I believe that the federal government should follow the States Act basic ideology, where whatever the state is agreed to do within its state for its voters, for its population, is going to be what the federal government approves. However, I do want to see 280E in the credit cards, and I want to see some criminal justice reform. Some of those things. I think that the criminal justice reform should still probably be by the state and what they're saying. So I think people have relied on the federal government way too much, and it needs to go back down to the states. That's how the Constitution was written. That's how it was supposed to be. It's become disproportionate to have somebody leading from a place that doesn't live in the state that represents it. It's the worst representative democracy you could possibly have.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up the Cole memo, because the timing of that, when Mr. Sessions, when he was there, who did that, I saw the impact it had on social media, especially, and community guidelines, and a lot of people were freaked out and had YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of followers. There's actually one company in California that this happened to. They pulled the plug with no warning, with like 250,000 subscribers to their work, and all they were doing was teaching the public. And this, do our social media platforms have too much power, because the consumer dictates pretty much where they get their stuff from, how they get it, and when they get it? Just opinion.
Yeah, that's a whole nother
hour.
That's a whole nother hour. I do think you have one side that they're public, and they should be able to decide what goes on their platform. But the problem is that if you're going to take that stance and you can hide behind not being prosecuted for misinformation on your own platform, I forget what it's called, 230. There's some bill that social media platforms are not liable, and so you can't have it both ways. And so you either have to remove one, or you have to you make it so they can be sued, or you have to say that, look, this is the town square, and that yes, you got to treat it like a regulated entity, like a publicly traded power company for Southern California or something like that.
Right. And the social media companies grew so fast, self-policing didn't work, and the FCC existed when television and radio started. You actually had to apply for licenses, and there were, forget the community guidelines. If you wanted to broadcast, you could do this. Now, with access to the internet, everybody's a broadcaster, and it is a total free-for-all out there with misinformation and information and self-policing. And I don't know. I came along with a great time for a cannabis and a media company, don't you think, Rob?
Yeah. I think that I think everybody needs to develop their own confidence in their own news sources, whether it's a news channel or an individual. And over time, they will build or lose that credibility. And so in that thinking process, that's the way it's supposed to work. We have people that have died for this country to have the right to have free speech, and you have to protect it both ways. There's times where people are going to say things you don't like. And whether it's misinformation or just hate speech or whatever it is, you'd let that go and don't censor any of it. And what naturally evolves is that nobody follows those people, or the people that follow those people that's, I think, how it should work its way out. But I think that government feels that people don't have the ability to discern if this is a good message or a bad message. And the problem is that government trying to shape that might be done with good intentions, but it might have shaped it the way that they thought was what was right. And that's a problem too.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? We're not going to solve all the the world's problems in a couple of minutes in an interview. But Rob, you've really educated me so much. Rob Sechrist from the Polaris Equity Group. If people are interested in finding out about your fund, especially, I've already been online. Why don't you give yourself a little plug how people can find out about you?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, polarisequitygroup.com. It's spelled differently, Pelorus. It's a navigation instrument, just so you know. But the quickest way is you could just email us at IR for investor relations at polarisequitygroup.com. And you can search to get the right spelling of that. And we look forward to speaking with you.
All right. Well, I enjoyed speaking with you, Rob Sechrist. I hope you'll continue to follow, like, and subscribe to some of the stuff that we're producing on a regular basis out of our studios here outside of Boston. But for now, that's going to wrap up In the Weeds with Jimmy Young. And remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Use it responsibly.
Hey, you want to grow your own plants? Check out Style Lighting's Grow Kit. It has everything you need to become an expert home grower and bring the power of the sun indoors. Style Lighting uses TCP's high-powered commercial LEDs that deliver twice the output in the market. The Grow Kit has a grow bag, a timer, chains to hang the light, and of course the best in the business lighting system by TCP. Check out stylelighting.shop for more information. Weed Talk and In the Weeds are two productions of Pro Cannabis Media supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.